There is a long intellectual tradition of studying the moral character of war. One of the key questions of this tradition is whether a war is just or unjust. What elements of this philosophical tradition can we apply to Russia's war against Ukraine and to Ukraine's resistance? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Jeff McMahan, an American moral philosopher and author of books such as Killing in War and The Ethics of Killing. Before we start, let me remind you that UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with the Department of Philosophy at the University of Tartu, which recently published a special issue of the journal on the Russia-Ukraine war. Jeff McMahan, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk. And you are a philosopher who wrote a couple of books, several books, including ones that interest us very much during this war, of course. One which is called Killing in War. The other is called The Ethics of Killing. And one of the subjects that you are focusing on in your studies, in your reflections, is the question of just war. And you also prepared a paper for a conference that my friend Aaron Wendland organized in Kyiv Mahila Academy recently. And the title of your paper is Just War Theory and the Russia-Ukraine War. So can you explain to our listeners why the just war theory is important today, and why have you decided to reflect upon it?
Well, just war theory is important because it is the result of the attempt by careful thinkers to understand the morality of war and what it is, when it is permissible to go to war and what it is permissible to do in war. And it is of practical importance because over the years, it has influenced the formulation of the international law of war, and it also has guided the action of at least some military people in the actual practice of war. So, one example of this is that in the United States, for many years now, the future officers in the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines often go through one of the military academies, like the U.S. Naval Academy or the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And these students who will become officers in the military are taught just war theory as part of the curriculum at, at these institutions. And so they actually study and discuss and are influenced by the writings of the just war theorists, both the older just war theorists from centuries ago and the contemporary just war theorists. And they bring this knowledge and this awareness of just war theory into their action in war.
Let me just dwell a little bit into this tradition. So it's indeed a long tradition, and there is an important Christian element of it. We have Saint Augustine, we have Thomas Aquinas, we have other Catholic, by the way, Catholic thinkers, lots of Catholic thinkers.
Yes.
We have theorists who were criticizing, for example, the colonialist wars in early 16th century, the Spanish thinkers.
Yes.
But we also have the Protestant thinkers like Pufendorf and like Hugo Grotius and others.
Yeah.
Can we summarize this theory of just war? Does it have kind of a strong message for us in the 21st century, although it has been developed long time ago?
Well, I'd I can't distill a single message from this very long tradition. You're quite right. Thinking about the ethics of war goes pretty far back. One of the first thinkers was pre-Christian, Cicero. Um, but what we call just war theory today has, over many centuries, been primarily developed, as you point out, by Christian thinkers. There have been parallel efforts by Chinese philosophers and Islamic philosophers and so on to develop their own understanding of the ethics of war. But the dominant understanding in the world today is the just war theory that has been developed over time by these Christian, both Catholic and Protestant thinkers. Um, there's so much variation in the history of thought about the just war that it's difficult to summarize. What we can say is that there are certain principles that almost all the theorists agree on, though they disagree about how these principles are to be interpreted. Um, there's, first of all, the theory of when it is permissible to go to war, when the resort to war is permissible. And this is referred to in the Christian tradition in the Latin term jus ad bellum. Um, and there are several principles that we find in the jus ad bellum. One is the principle of just cause. This is the claim that in order for it to be permissible to go to war, one has to have an aim or some aims that are to be pursued by war that are essentially just. Then the pursuit of the just aim is supposed to be constrained in the resort to war by principles of necessity and proportionality. The necessity principle says you mustn't go to war if there is some alternative, less violent, less harmful means of trying to achieve the just aim. Proportionality says that the pursuit of the just aim must not have bad effects that are excessive in relation to the importance of achieving the just aim. And there's also what's a couple of other principles. One's called right intention, that one has to be motivated in going to war by the intention to achieve the just cause. And there's also what's called the principle of last resort, which is that you shouldn't go to war until you've exhausted all the other possible options. I think that this is actually an unnecessary separate principle because it's really found already within the principles of necessity and proportionality. And then there are a range of principles that just war theorists have agreed on that govern the conduct of war. Principle among these is what's called the requirement of discrimination. It says that um, one mustn't attack anything but targets that are legitimate. And what this means is one should not intentionally attack civilians, at least in the traditional understanding of the term. One shouldn't intentionally attack civilian infrastructure, that sort of thing. Then there are parallel principles of necessity and proportionality that govern individual acts of war. So most people in the long tradition of just war theory accept some versions of these basic principles, and so that's what we have in the 21st century. Though there's a great deal of disagreement about how these principles should be understood.
Well, disagreement is a good thing. It means that it is a long debate, which was started as far away as Cicero. Um, what sometimes you can read in like very short articles about just war problem is that there is two elements, and you mentioned them. It's use ad bellum, the causes of the war, and use in bello, the way how you conduct the war. And am I right to say that actually many wars fail to be called just wars, not because of the first principle, because the first principle is why every side has a certain, motivation or certain aim or certain goal, but basically the second principle, the way how you conduct the war, by killing civilians, by doing mass murder, by doing mass rape, by destroying cities, by making ecocide, by making urbicide. Is this the use in bello, the way how you conduct the war, the most difficult one? What do you think?
Uh, well, it is the one about which there is the greatest controversy, but not quite in the way that you suggest. There is a recent division among just war thinkers between those who uh, believe that use in bello is independent of use ad bellum. And what that means is that what it's permissible to do in war does not depend on whether the war you're fighting is actually a just war. And then there are others who think that use in bello depends on use ad bellum. And what that means is that these people believe, and I'm one of them, that what it's permissible to do in war depends crucially on whether one was justified in going to war in the first place. And so this has very important implications for the morality of what soldiers do in war.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand your point because, for example, the Second World War, the let's think about bombing of the German cities, sometimes disproportionate, sometimes too much. And well, one can say that it is permissible because we are fighting the biggest evil, which is Nazi Germany, and therefore, it is permissible to do even that harm for civilians. I don't really buy this argument because we have the Red Army, we have the cruelties of the Red Army, we have mass raping, and the extensive cruelty, which does not of course justify the fact that we are fighting against Nazism, which is the biggest evil. So I understand that the difficulty is in this. But let me come to the Russia-Ukrainian war, and you made the paper on it, and I think it's very 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 much important. But before I go to the very question about just war, let me ask a different question. When you were mentioning that American or European officers are studying these just war theory, I just cannot imagine that happening in the Russian army. I just cannot imagining people in the Russian army studying Cicero or Thomas Aquinas or Pufendorf or Bartolomé de las Casas or others. And it's not only because of the question that, okay, well, humanities and the question of human dignity hasn't really entered the Russian discourse for many centuries. But the thing is, I think, is that the very idea of the law is absent in the Russian political tradition, and it has very long history of that. And another reason is that what I was trying to say all the time when I talk to my foreign friends and colleagues is that the theory of international humanitarian law, of just war theory, is a question how you use law to limit violence, to restrict violence, to put some frames on violence. Well, what Russians are trying to do right now, and what they try to do sometimes also in the past, is to use violence to limit law. You see that absolutely different way to put it. So they're trying to use violence to make the international order upside down, to break the rules. Basically, they don't think about how to follow the rules. They're thinking what is the most efficient way to break the rules, and therefore maybe the cruelty that they use right now is so horrible. What do you think?
I agree with what you're saying. I know very little of the history of Russia, I have to confess, but what I know does confirm what you're saying, that the rule of law, as it is understood in the West, has never really taken hold in Russia. Russian thinkers and political figures have had almost no serious engagement with philosophical thought, and in particular with the thought of moral philosophers. It is actually conspicuous that over history, I can't think of a single good Russian moral philosopher. They're, they were influenced, of course, by Marx, who was, in many ways, a good political philosopher, though the ways in which the Russians distorted and perverted his views led to, the most awful suffering of many millions of people in the 20th century. Um, so, yes, I mean, I do see Russia as a country that wishes not to be constrained by international law and to be, consistently violating it.
There is one Russian moral thinker that is very influential, and it is Leon Tolstoy. And but the problem with his theory of non-resistance to evil, non-violent resistance to evil, or but the ban of on violent resistance to evil, is that it is very comfortable for Russian power, because if the Russian power is based on violence, and it is just is based upon the internal violence and external violence, it is of course very comfortable to have a theory and to propagate around the world that you should not resist against evil by force. So it's also paradox, a very long discussion which we have in Ukraine, also as to how much the so-called Great Russian culture is actually a tool also of some power politics. But let me ask about the current war. How do you think the concepts of just war are applied? Is can Russia's actions be justified in any argument as just war? Can Ukrainian actions be justified as just war? What is your analysis?
I think on any understanding of the principles of jus ad bellum, there is no way that one could understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a just war. Um, the Russian government made at least two claims that they thought could justify the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine. One was that they were uh, preventing the genocide of Ukrainians by a basically Nazi government. And that was just a simple lie. And what puzzles me is why, if any of the Russian soldiers believed that before they got to Ukraine, they couldn't possibly continue to believe that after they were in Ukraine and among Ukrainian people. There would be no factual basis for that whatsoever. The other claim they made was that they were defending Russia against aggression by Ukraine. Now, there was no current aggression, so they had to make the claim that this was some sort of preventive war. That if Russia didn't go to war against Ukraine, then it would be threatened by Ukraine in the future. That also seems to me to be a lie. I can't believe myself that Putin or any of his colleagues really believed that. It seems to me that the reasons why the Russian government decided to go to war against Ukraine were purely self interested and unjust. One of them was to try to reestablish the Russian Empire and expand the power of Putin and his elite cronies in the government and in the economic sector in Russia. And the other is the threat that was posed to Russia by having an independent, flourishing democracy right there on the border of Russia, challenging the legitimacy and desirability of the tyrannical kleptocracy that Putin has been in charge of for decades now. And so, no, there's no way that anybody could think that Russia's war in Ukraine has a just cause or is a just war in any way, nor is it being fought in accordance with the rules of war. Russia has consistently engaged in terrorist attacks on Ukraine, attacking cities, attacking energy generating facilities, destroying hospitals and schools, and so on. So, in every conceivable respect, this is an unjust war that is being pursued by means that are not only wrongful morally, but illegal.
And I do think these two elements go hand in hand. And the second element, use in bello, actually explains the first one because it's indeed horrifying how cruel the Russian army is. How they actually, you cannot understand. This is what I'm arguing all the time. You cannot understand this war if you have either capitalist or Marxist view on it. So if you have a purely materialistic view on it as a war for resources or a war for territory, there is something very deep psychological. It's all about geopolitics or psychopolitics or geopsychology. There is some element of this willingness to punish. So very sadomasochistic willingness to punish somebody who doesn't want to behave like you want. And this the way how this war is fought actually explains to us that the first principle is also not a third, because the reason is not really the goal of the war, as Russia is trying to explain, but the very practice of it. They just want to punish, they just want to commit crimes. But let me address
Well,
Ukraine, and I think,
can we stay on that for just one
yeah, yeah,
moment?
yeah, sure,
Let me
sure.
make 2 points here. One is just to confirm what you said. That is, part of the pretense that Russia makes is that really people in Ukraine are deep down there really Russian. They are really, the brothers and sisters of the Russian people and need to be embraced within the Russian Empire. They're really all one people and should be acting together in solidarity. But if you believe this kind of stuff about Ukrainians, why are you so intent on killing them all? Uh, and one thing I think is certainly true, and that is that uh, if Putin wanted to do the one thing that would permanently alienate Ukrainians from Russia and make Ukrainians hate and detest Russia, it's go to war against them in the way that he has done. The second point I wanted to make is just this. You said that the second explains the first, and I think actually also the first explains the second. That is, um, one reason why the conduct of the war is wrong is that the war itself is unjust. And if you're trying to pursue unjust goals by force and violence, nothing you do can be permissible. Even attacking Ukrainian soldiers is wrong. Ukrainian soldiers are not legitimate targets for Russian soldiers. Ukrainian soldiers are people who are simply engaged in trying to defend themselves and other innocent people against wrongful attack. That doesn't make them legitimate targets for Russian soldiers. Every instance of violence by a Russian soldier is wrong, whether it's directed against civilians or against soldiers. It's all impermissible.
But let me address Ukrainian case because I think it's more complicated, because there are. I think we all agree that the Ukrainian resistance is a just war in terms of use ad bellum. So obviously, and this is the consensus of all the thinkers that we are discussing. The defensive war, when you need to defend yourself, is a just war. But then comes the next question: you use in bello. So what are the limitations? What Ukrainians should avoid to do when they engage into this war, so that the concepts of just war continue to apply, not only with regard to goals but with regard to conduct.
Well, it seems to me that Ukraine must have its soldiers obey the rules of war. And in particular, what this means is that Ukrainian forces must never target Russian civilians. There is some evidence that this may have happened in attacks on, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think the town is Belgorod. Um, Civilians were killed in those attacks some months ago. Um, and I think it's very important now that Ukraine is controlling the area around Kursk, if I'm getting the pronunciation correct, that the Ukrainian forces there treat the civilian population with respect. Now, this is true for fundamental moral reasons, namely, these people, the Russian civilians, have not made themselves liable to military attack. They are civilians. They haven't contributed in any way sufficient to the unjust aggression against Ukraine to make them legitimate targets for any kind of military action. So these people should be treated with respect, not treated in the way that Ukrainian prisoners have been treated by Russian forces in Ukraine. But there's another reason, which is purely self interested, and that is that if Ukrainian forces violate the moral rules of engagement, or if they violate the rules governing the conduct of war, they will be undermining their own legitimacy in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of Russian civilians as well. This war will end, I think, sooner if the population of Russia become exhausted by it and press Putin and his government to end this war. And they're less likely to do that if they think that Ukrainians are harming ordinary Russian civilians. So it's very, very important that Ukrainian forces should adhere very strictly to the moral rules of war and the law of armed conflict.
Yes, Ukraine wants to be a country which is observing the international law. Obviously, the problem is that it's fighting a country which does not observe the international law, and here we have this asymmetry. But so far, you discussed the way how Ukrainians can overreach, overreact, and be disproportionate. For example, target civilians, right?
Well, that
But
would be a violation of discrimination rather than of proportionality, really.
yeah,
But
l-
yeah,
but let me ask a question about proportionality
sure.
because it's really very important. One thing that Ukrainians are asking international partners is give us a permission to target Russian targets, military targets, well beyond 100 kilometers of the Russian from the Russian border because they are fighting us from that distance. Another claim is that well, Russians are trying to destroy Ukrainian energy sector, energy infrastructure, and we need to have the proportional means. Otherwise, they will continue to do that, and therefore, Ukraine is starting to attack Russian energy infrastructure. Um, what do you think of that? So, is it an argument of proportionality? Is that look, we are now not overreaching, we are now underreaching because we cannot really reestablish this proportionality. And if Russians can do much more to Ukrainians than Ukrainians can do to Russians, that means impunity. That means basically that the Russians will do everything they can do, and Ukrainians will suffer and will accept what they must accept is as in famous story told by Thucydides in the history of Peloponnesian War. What do you think?
Well, you made two separate points. One about attacks on military targets deep inside Russia, and the other about attacks on energy facilities. And I think those are quite different. I think that the Western countries should withdraw the restrictions on the use of weapons supplied to Ukraine that prevent Ukraine from striking military targets deep inside Russia, from which Russia is launching attacks against Ukraine. Um, there is a question of proportionality there. That is, if Ukraine begins to make many military strikes deep inside Russia, this does increase the risk of escalation to the use of nuclear weapons, and that could lead to war on a catastrophic scale. So one has to be careful about that. But it does seem to me that uh, the concern about escalation is what is motivating the Western suppliers of weapons to Ukraine to want to restrict the range of the use of these weapons. But I think that those restrictions should be removed. I think it would be militarily very effective for Ukraine to be able to make strikes over longer distances. And I don't think the risk of escalation is so great that it would be disproportionate to do that. On the case of strikes against energy facilities, however, I think that would be a terrible mistake. I know that Russia has been striking energy facilities in Ukraine for a very long time, from very early on in the war. But what this does is it does harm businesses and industry, but it also harms civilians. And we have to distinguish here between military action that is defensive and military action that is a reprisal. And a reprisal means something like this: if you do this to us, we're going to do it to you. And part of the point of reprisals is to deter the enemy from making the strikes on one's own country. So it seems to me maybe what people have in mind when they want Ukraine to strike energy facilities in Russia is that this is communicating to Russia that if you continue to strike our energy facilities, we will strike yours. And I think that is wrong. That is, I think reprisals are not, in general, morally justifiable. When Ukraine strikes energy facilities, this, I think, is probably counterproductive. It makes those civilians whose power goes out in Russia think of Ukrainians as their enemies, and that is not helpful to Ukraine. It is also possibly verging on terrorism if you're destroying uh, civilian infrastructure in Russia. That is prima facie wrong. And so I don't think there's a justification for the attacks on energy facilities. I do think that there is a justification for attacking military targets deep inside Russian territory.
Let me make a counterpoint on civilians. Can we really distinguish between, let's say, okay, if we're talking about just some particular civilians, it's one thing, but another thing is that there is a Russian nation. I don't know if there is a Russian nation, but there is some number of people, over 100 of millions, which supported their government, which produced the Putinism, and which support the war. So there is no alternative to the war. There is no opposition to the war in the Russian society. Mm, we cannot find anything like opposition to Vietnam War in the United States, anything like opposition to Iraq War in the United States, in Europe, anything like opposition to Israel's attacks on Gaza in multiple places of the world. So That's a big question also for us about morality, the moral responsibility of Russian civilians. But about the energy infrastructure, well, if you can say that, and basically this is what Ukrainians are saying, is that the facilities that are targeted are basically the oil refineries, and they are massively used in this war because it's a fuel supply to tanks, to airplanes, and there we entering a very tiny thing. What is the difference between civilian and military? So what would you reply?
I think, well, you made 2 points there. One was about the responsibility of Russian civilians. And I agree with you. I do think, at least up to a certain point, I do think that it is the moral responsibility of Russian civilians to oppose this war, to express their disapproval, to protest it in certain ways. But the Russians, I think, have more. I mean, the more excusing conditions apply to Russians than apply, for example, to Israelis right now in the war in Gaza. And that is, the Russian population does not have the same kind of access to impartial information that other people have. Their access to information is restricted by their government. They live still in something approximating a totalitarian society. And also, the penalties for protest or dissent in Russia are very severe. If you go out and openly protest against the war in Ukraine, in Russia, you will get put in jail. And I don't know what happens to those people who go to jail there. I doubt if it's very pleasant. This is a a ruthless totalitarian government. Do they really have a democracy? I don't think so. No, there's no way that they could get rid of Putin through elections. And as I say, they will be punished very harshly if they express uh, dissent uh, uh, from the government view about the war there. So it's very different from the war in Gaza, where people in Israel do actually have access to all the information and still support the slaughter of Palestinian children. Um, so I think, for example, that the responsibilities of individual Israeli citizens are much, much greater than the responsibilities of individual Russian citizens. Though I do think, as I said before, that they have a duty to oppose this war. But if they are not fulfilling that duty, that does not seem to me to make it permissible for Ukraine to impose extreme, at least very extreme forms of harm on them. I do think that they have made themselves liable to the small harms that might come to them from economic sanctions, and quite possibly they might be liable to suffer energy shortages, power cuts, and that kind of thing. Though, would that actually help Ukraine or hurt Ukraine? I doubt that it's going to make any difference to the uh, 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 military forces fighting in Ukraine. Um, I really don't think that it's, but then I don't know that for sure, but I do have my doubts about that. Um, uh,
Let me
I'm
before be-
forgetting what the
yeah
second point was.
mm, before you answer the second part,
Okay.
let me just make a very short point. I understand that the topic is very difficult, and of course, well, human life is the highest value everywhere, in Russia, in Ukraine, in China, in Gaza, everywhere. But the point, and I understand your point about Russian civilians, but the problem is that it's Russian civilians who brought Putin to power. And they had the chance to have full democracy in 1990s, and they consciously rejected it. And they have been rejecting it point by point, year by year. And that's the problem. Ukrainians had the same problem actually coming back of authoritarianism, but Ukrainians succeeded to reject it. And that's not a question to our podcast, but that's a question rather about political theory, how we can really distinguish between an authoritarian government and the people who are in democracy sovereign, the true sovereign. But my second part of the question was that in the question of oil refineries, basically Ukrainians are targeting it because to cut the Russian fuel supplies to their military operations, including to their airplanes from which they send bombs to on Ukrainian children and women and civilians, and on Russian tanks and everything else. What do you think?
If the attacks are limited to oil refineries, um, and not, for example, on civilian energy power stations, and if attacks on oil refineries really do affect the ability of the Russian planes and tanks to conduct their missions, then I think it probably is permissible. Certainly, we were talking earlier about the Allied destruction and bombing of German cities in the Second World War. That was not only immoral, but a strategic mistake. It didn't undermine German morale, it increased German morale. And the same thing was true of German attacks on London and other Allied cities. Um, so but on the other hand, what we know from history is that Allied attacks on oil sources of fuel in World War II for the tanks and the trains and that sort of thing that were essential to the military efforts of the Nazis, those were in fact highly effective. If something like that is true today, and I simply don't know the facts, but if it's true, then yes, attacks on oil refineries in Russia would be justified. I thought you were referring more to the kind of attacks that Russia makes on Ukraine, attacking power stations that supply electrical power and heating and that sort of thing to civilian areas in Ukraine.
No, no, no. It doesn't happen to my knowledge. So what Russians are trying to do really now is to cut all the Ukrainian economy, civilians from energy. So they practically destroyed the thermal power plant network, and they're trying now to target the nuclear network, not by targeting the nuclear power stations, but by targeting the so-called substations, which are transmitting electricity. And that's obviously a war against civilians. What Ukrainians are trying to do is to target oil refineries, which of course can supply Russian cars, civilian cars, but also can supply Russian tanks and Russian airplanes. And to my knowledge, there are no attack on civilian energy and infrastructure. Let me ask a difficult question about Kursk operation. So, what Ukrainians are now doing, some can argue that Ukrainians are violating the territorial integrity of Russia, and some can argue that this is true. This is what happening. Ukrainians have entered the what is internationally recognized as sovereign Russian territory. What Ukrainian argument can be is that look, you cannot really wage a war on your own territory. If the enemy has invaded you, then you can use proportionate measures to invade the enemy's territory to search for weak points in the enemy's territory. And it appears that in this war, paradoxically, the weak points of Russia are not the occupied Ukrainian territories that Russia defended so much with minefields and with everything, but the sovereign Russian territories. So the question that Ukrainians are asking since 2022, if you followed one of the first big articles of then Chief Commander Valery Zaluzhny, he was arguing that look, one of the major problems in this war is precisely the lack of proportionality. That Russians can strike Ukraine from a very long distance, Ukrainians cannot strike back, that Russia has occupied parts of Ukrainian territories, Ukrainian has not occupied at that point parts of Russia. What do you think about Kursk operation? Is it justifiable in terms of just war theory?
Well, what you were just suggesting at the end of your remarks there was that maybe the occupation of this border area in Russia is a form of reprisal for the occupation of areas in eastern Ukraine. And that does not seem to me to be justifiable. However, it does seem to me to be justifiable for Ukrainian forces to enter Russian territory with the aim of uh, thwarting or frustrating the Russian military efforts in Ukraine. So, one of the things that Ukraine has done in the regions it has occupied is to destroy bridges. And this prevents the Russians from being able to bring supplies to their own forces across those bridges. Um, it also has enabled Ukraine to capture a number of Russian soldiers and also establish a kind of buffer zone between a buffer zone on the other side of the Ukrainian border, which does contribute to the defense of Ukraine against Russian land forces. And to that extent, it does seem to me that the movement of Ukrainian military forces into Russia is perfectly legitimate. This happens in war. It has to happen in war. It happens in just war. Um, it was in World War II, the Allied forces, of course, had to enter Germany and attack German forces on their own territory. That's perfectly legitimate.
Yes, I don't think about this in terms of reprisal. I rather think in terms of what you're saying, because Ukrainians do not want to keep this territory. We want our territory back. And this is a usage of these lands with the hope that maybe it will influence Russians. Let me ask a final question, and it will be a philosophical one because we we are both philosophers. In your book "Killing in War," you quote Ludwig Wittgenstein, whom you called, I think, the greatest philosopher of 20th century. Frankly speaking, I still lack patience to read through Wittgenstein. I am from a different tradition, what we call continental tradition. So my canon is rather the French, German, Polish, Ukrainian philosophy, rather than like this more analytical philosophy uh, from Britain, from America, from Austria. And let me quote one of my favorite philosophers of the 20th century, who is Raymond Aron, the French, one of the greatest French philosophers. And you surely know his great book, La guerre et la paix entre les nations, the war and peace among nations, 1962, written during Caribbean crisis, where he's talking about the fact that during the nuclear age, we have some new form of peace. It's not a peace by balance of powers. It's not a peace by hegemony. It's not a peace by empire, as in previous times. But it's a peace by fear. And I think it's an interesting way, especially to interpret the Caribbean crisis, is that basically both Khrushchev and Kennedy had so much fear about the global nuclear war that finally they retreated. What I now observe is that we lost the balance of fear. The West is so much afraid of Russia, and Russia is so much not afraid of the West. And this, of course, creates the situation of unjust war that Russia is waging. So we still have a situation when Russia is still not afraid, and it is using its nuclear blackmailing to spread fear. And I see, for example, when I talk to Western Europeans, I see this fear in the eyes of everybody. And I still kind of lack arguments, not maybe lack emotions, to persuade them that it is precisely this fear that creates this war. That unfortunately we need a balance of fear, and so far we don't have it. What do you think about this?
Well, let me first say, what I must have said in my book, I can't remember, is not that Wittgenstein actually is the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, but that he is widely regarded as that or something of the sort. I don't like Wittgenstein either. I've read his books and I don't like either one of them, and I don't like Wittgenstein as a person. I just uh, anyway, I have no fondness for Wittgenstein or his philosophy. Um, in fact, he's sort of the villain of my book, whereas the hero of my book is the German who refused to become a Nazi soldier and was beheaded. But let me turn to your actual question about nuclear deterrence. Um, in the West, we have to talk about this and we can be open about it. And people do say, and I say, we have to take account of the risk of escalation to nuclear war, and that affects the proportionality of what we can do militarily. In Russia, of course, nobody says this, but that doesn't, because it is a totalitarian society and nobody can say anything that Putin disapproves of. And Putin likes to be able to use threats and the eliciting of fear in the West as a tool. But that doesn't mean that he is not afraid too. That is, he has threatened many times to use his nuclear weapons. He does this in a way that no Western leader could do because the Western leaders are democratically elected. And I don't think, this refers back to something you said earlier. I don't really think that Russians chose not to have democracy. They had it stolen from them by authoritarian dictators who deceived them and tricked them and so on. Uh, but that's beside the point. The point is Putin doesn't want Russia to be destroyed. He doesn't want to see the Kremlin turned to ashes in a nuclear explosion. He doesn't want to see Moscow erased from the globe. So he's going to be cautious too, but he can afford to appear reckless and fearless. But surely he's not. And he makes these threats, but so far there's no suggestion that he's willing to risk a nuclear war with the West by using nuclear weapons himself. So I do think that there is a kind of symmetry in the fear. I don't think it is that he lacks the fear. I mean, I do think it's that he has fewer constraints on his use of military force, including nuclear weapons, than any Western leader. That's true. Um, who is more likely to use nuclear weapons first, Putin or the West? Well, obviously, Putin. But still, I think he is restrained by fear, just as we are.
Maybe you're right, but still, I feel that when I talk to my European, American, other colleagues, I feel this in their eyes, and I think this is what Putin is playing upon, this balance of fear. And frankly speaking, I don't buy the argument about democracy because, well, Khrushchev was afraid of Kennedy, and America at the time, Northern America, was a democratic state, and Gorbachev or Andropov were really afraid of Reagan, and I think what happened since 1960s and 1980s is that Western democracies lost the faith in themselves. They lost precisely the faith in democracy. They lost the faith that their democracy or your democracy is genuine. And I think it's a profound problem on which Putin is playing, and therefore, you know, I think we should all be aware of the fact that this play on the fear is very dangerous. What I said back in 2014, the fear of provoking Russia provokes Russia. Jeff McMahon, thank you so much for this conversation, a very interesting one and very detailed one. And I hope we really touched upon very problematic issues. I mean, that is very difficult to reply to, but it's a question of moral reflection, which is also a big tradition of what we call reluctantly now the West, which totally lacks in such countries as Russia. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. I've enjoyed this very much and hope we will keep in touch.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko, I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of Pan-Ukraine. My guest today was Jeff McMahan, an American moral philosopher and author of books such as Killing in War and The Ethics of Killing. Let me remind you that UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with the Department of Philosophy at the University of Tartu, which recently published a special issue of their journal on the Russian-Ukraine war. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.